Let's talk about white Christian nationalism. It's one of the greatest threats to our country, our rights, and our vaginas, and yet one of the least understood. Because while I'm sure you have a picture in your head when I say white Christian nationalist, I'm guessing this guy, there's a lot more influence, history, and scary goals that lie below the surface of this Project 2025 shaped iceberg. Ones that most people don't even know about. And it's not because they aren't looking or don't care. It's because this movement is masterful in disguising itself as a fascist in a Christian's clothing. So I'm partnering with People for the American Way to provide a thorough primer on Christian nationalism, specifically white Christian nationalism. What it is, what it isn't, the history behind this movement, what motivates it, and how they want our country to look. Oh, and how you can stop them. Now, whether you realize it or not, you have definitely heard Christian nationalist talking points. They're everywhere. On TV.
Law enforcement officers are ministers of God sent to punish evildoers.
I think a lot of what the left supports is satanic.
You either impose a Christian value or that vacuum is going to be filled by something else.
On the internet.
As far as forcing people to believe what we believe, yes.
I want a supreme leader, totalitarian, Christian dictator.
I want to make sure that everyone believes in what I believe in. It's that everyone needs to believe in Christianity.
And even in our public institutions.
Father, we just claim Oklahoma for you. Every square inch, we claim it for you in the name of Jesus.
This society, United States of America, was built on the foundation, of what happened thousands of years ago in the Holy Land.
So if we are going to have one nation under God, which we must, we have to have one religion.
White Christian nationalism is ubiquitous in America, from high-ranking elected officials to evangelical interest groups to extreme right-wing factions. And right now, all of those blocs are working together towards a single goal: to force their extreme, unpopular ideology on the rest of America, whether we want it or not. So what is white Christian nationalism? You might wonder why I keep including the word white. And it's not because I'm some reverse racist, whatever that means. It's because this is a specific ideology that relies on a white identity, which supersedes everything else, both the Christian and the nationalist part. And look, call me controversial, but I don't like religious extremism of any sort. Any type of fanatical religious or ideological movement results in a push to take away others' rights and control their way of life. That's not good. But white Christian nationalism specifically is a unique and dangerous ideology that poses maybe the most dire threat to our country and our democracy right now. But before we get into that, I should define plain old Christian nationalism. The Christian part of the term refers to the religion of Christianity, and nationalism is an identity or loyalty to one's nation state, for example, America. This is often and especially to the detriment of other foreign parties. Together, those ideas of Christianity and nationalism create a specific ideology. Freedom Forum writer Scott A. Leadingham defines Christian nationalism as the belief that the United States is a country defined by Christianity. This includes ideas like the government should protect and advocate for Christian values and pass laws that reflect those values, or at least certain interpretations of them. Christian nationalists also believe that separation of church and state isn't real, and that God's divine plan includes America's success. Well, Christian America's success. These talking points can be found in pretty much any denomination of Christianity, regardless of race. But to define white Christian nationalism, I'm going to cite a book that was a major source for this video. It's called The Flag and the Cross: White Christian Nationalism and the Threat to American Democracy. It's written by sociology professors Philip Gorski and Samuel Perry, and it's an extremely enlightening book. Essentially, Gorski and Perry try to follow the development of modern white Christian nationalism in the United States, partly to explain how we got from point A to January 6th. In the first part of the book, the professors survey people to create a Christian nationalism scale, basically a way to see where Christian nationalism and whiteness intersect and amplify each other. For example, at the start of the book, they show these two panels with various scores on the Christian nationalism scale. The higher these factions score, the more they think the US is defined by Christianity. This one, panel A, shows general Christian denominations like Presbyterian, Jehovah's Witness, and Pentecostal. Pentecostal is at the top. the most Christian nationalist denomination, with United Church of Christ at the bottom. Now this panel, Panel B, focuses on ethno-religious traditions. Those are combinations of religious and racial identities. These categories include white, black, Hispanic, and Eastern Orthodox Christians. It probably won't surprise you to learn that white evangelicals scored highest on this scale, but it's worth noting that black conservative Protestants were the second highest category. This demonstrates that people of all races can embrace Christian nationalist ideas. Black conservative Protestants, for example, might think about how MLK Jr. used scripture to convince Christians to be better on the ideas of racial justice. And it's not a far leap to get from there to the idea that scripture should be in our government. But just like white Southern Christians had a very different opinion of MLK Jr., recent research shows that Christian nationalism affects white Americans in a unique way. Let's go back to Gorski and Perry. Gorski and Perry asked various respondents basic questions about American political history. For example, did the Supreme Court stop students from praying in public schools? But the results of these questions were staggering, especially when you see the differences between white and black respondents. There is a huge disparity between secular white Americans and white Christian nationalists in terms of correctly answering these factual questions. Conversely, while there is an uptick the higher you get on the Christian nationalism scale as a black American, it is much less different than for secular black Americans. Basically, the higher you score as a white American, the less likely you are to know basic facts. But this doesn't apply to everything. When asked about universally accepted scientific concepts, white Christian nationalists scored about the same as everyone else. It's only when it came to hot-button culture war topics that the situation changed drastically. Take history, for instance. Less than 10% of white secular Americans opposed removing Confederate statues. But look at the other end of the scale. Almost 100% of white Christian nationalists went to bat for Robert E. Lee, just like Jesus would have wanted. But this trend applies to a lot more than high school science and Civil War history. Take a look at this graph about COVID. These people at the top right corner, the highest part of the Christian nationalism scale, yeah, their most trusted source on COVID was Donald Trump. And all the way down here, that's the CDC, scientists, and medical professionals. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, how can someone be grounded enough to accept atoms and lasers, but get their medical advice from Donald Trump? And why does this pattern seem to only apply to white Christian nationalists? Well, first, we'll need to define white Christian nationalism as an ideology. White Christian nationalism is focused on that first word, white. While Christian nationalism more broadly is centered on the idea that America is inherently Christian and should tout Christian values above all else, white Christian nationalism takes that already dicey idea to an even darker place. Essentially, white Christian nationalists believe that yes, America is a Christian nation, but their vision of a Christian nation is rooted in white supremacy. And we're not just talking about preachers and pastors saying stuff like this. People involved in the secular worlds like media and politics say this stuff all the time, but they usually use different words. Sometimes they'll talk about defending Judeo-Christian values or protecting Western civilization, vaguish ideas that are still palatable to a less religious right-wing audience.
The United States of America, it was founded on Judeo-Christian values.
We're undercutting the values of Western civilization, of free thought.
It's civilization ending poison.
And that might not sound so bad. I mean, they're just standing for our beautiful, gleaming, well-endowed country. But in this context, Judeo-Christian values means white.
White, not a culture? You mean Western civilization, the greatest civilization the world has ever seen, isn't a culture? Because we're white? That's racism.
These stand-in words, at least when they're used more subtly,
that's racism,
are called dog whistles. It's like a physical dog whistle. They emit a tone, or in this case, meaning, that only certain people can understand. It's meant to evoke a strong emotion from a seemingly innocuous phrase. For example, conservatives love to refer to Barack Obama by his full name.
Barack Hussein Obama.
Barack Hussein Obama.
Barack Hussein Obama.
I know what you're thinking. Kat, you're such a snowflake. What's wrong with using his middle name? It's on his birth certificate, supposedly. Sure, but that's not the point. These are people who constantly fearmonger about Muslims. And by emphasizing Hussein, a name associated with an Iraqi dictator, they are trying to activate a fear response in your brain. Similarly, you could get, canceled for saying the N-word on television, or just making brazen generalizations about the black community. But if you replace black with inner city, you can claim plausible deniability when you are rightfully called out for your racism.
In an affluent school district, this isn't, the inner city, you would think that these kids would have some kind of a value system.
This practice of obfuscation is central to all bigoted movements. Most people don't want to admit their own biases, at least publicly. That's why it's so effective to sanitize racist opinions as community concern, or hatred towards queer people as protecting children, or white supremacy, whether consciously or not, as Christian values. Now, I don't talk a lot about my own views on religion publicly, but I do take it very seriously. My parents made a real effort to not force religion on my brother or myself. My dad was raised in a Muslim household in Lebanon, and my mom's family was Protestant. I went to Catholic school because there were a lot of great academic opportunities, but I was never pressured into any faith. That being said, I found great comfort in Christianity growing up. On my own accord, I read the Bible, asked my parents to send me to a Christian summer camp every year, and chose to get baptized. Now I more identify with values rather than a specific faith, but I do believe in things we can't understand. And religion, interfaith displays, and the memory of daily chapel services as a kid still bring me great comfort to this day. I say all of this because I want to make it very clear that Christianity and religion are not inherently evil. They give a lot of people a sense of strength and community and purpose. They spur many to think larger than themselves and help others. This is not a space to demonize or make fun of faith, even if you don't believe in it. But for the white Christian nationalists who are building power to reshape our country, religion acts as a camouflage for the ideas underneath it. And the reason we know that is because, despite what you may have heard, the word America is not in the Bible. In fact, the entire faith is centered around a Jewish guy who died in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. His ideas are still pretty popular, maybe you've heard of them, but they're probably a lot more woke than Tucker Carlson would like. That's why white Christian nationalists had to create their own religious political identity, one focused more on bigotry than beatitudes. For these people, Christian is a key part of their sense of self, but so is white and American. Ironically, it's kind of similar to the idea of the Christian Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Three separate entities that are also somehow one, each part equal to the other. So if a person's worldview is simultaneously shaped around their race and their national identity, and then justified by religious devotion, it's no mystery how all of those become synonymous in that person's mind. White Christian nationalists seek to institutionalize their version of Christianity in our government. And for them, that faith is intrinsic to whiteness. Gorski and Perry summarize this concept perfectly. It's not just religious nostalgia or even religious conservatism. Rather, it's an acute strain of ethno-traditionalism in which white and Christian are conflated into a single identity. White Christian. It's how we get results like this. If you're white and a Christian nationalist, you're more likely to think we need more guns in society, that voting is too accessible, and that Antifa was responsible for January 6th. You're probably a strong believer in free market capitalism and the Electoral College, and you most likely think white people suffer more discrimination than black people. In case you didn't know, none of those ideas are in the Bible. Yeah, Jesus did not in fact say January 6th was a setup.
On the morning of January 6th, I was in the shower. The Lord came to me in the shower. A voice clearly told me, do not go to the Capitol.
And while Christian nationalists of all races believe in core ideals, like the Constitution was divinely inspired, there is a direct correlation between believing right-wing misinformation and your identity as a Christian nationalist if you are a white American. Once again, this is not about religion. It's about far-right ideology and fascist goals. Specifically, to take away freedoms from people who don't deserve them. Women, people of color, LGBTQ people, non-Christians, the poor. The list is endless. So how did we get here? Well, to be clear, Christian nationalism and white supremacy are not new ideas, especially in America. This country was founded by the blood of Native peoples and black slaves. And Christianity has always been used as justification for that domination. Even before Jamestown, Christopher Columbus justified his genocide of Native tribes as an effort to spread Christianity. through a crusade to bring about the apocalypse. Great normal guy. But as far as the continental United States goes, fascist predecessors have always used Christianity as a tool for subjugation. Early English settlers, for instance, used the Bible as justification for colonizing native lands. Specifically Genesis 1:28. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. Now, their motivation was debatable, to say the least, but some missionaries did genuinely try to convert native tribes. For example, John Eliot spent years translating the Bible into Algonquian. These efforts were at best paternalistic, and far less common than outright aggression in the name of God. This is actually how we get the Pocahontas story. Jamestown was ordered to Christianize all the local natives, and when that didn't work, the London Company came in and slaughtered them instead. Pocahontas was actually a hostage, a bargaining chip used to end the war. Now, as Europeans began to colonize North America, they saw the Atlantic slave trade as necessary for their growth. I mean, how are you supposed to succeed without brutally enslaving people? I should note that many Christians, especially in the North, were a large part of the abolitionist movement. But at the same time, many slave owners, especially in the South, used Christianity as an excuse for enslavement. They often cited scripture, particularly a story from the Old Testament where Noah's son Ham was condemned to perpetual servitude. Some went even further. Georgia Bishop Stephen Elliott celebrated the fact that millions have been made to know their Savior through the means of African slavery. Not only that, but this was apparently the only way semi-barbarous people could learn obedience, perseverance, and self-control. It's like I'm reading a Florida textbook. Now, during and after the Civil War, these concepts melded even more into white Christianity. Despite taking one of the most historic L's of all time, white Confederates used Christianity to create an alternate reality of Southern victimhood. This is where we get the lost cause myth. The idea that the Civil War was about states' rights and not slavery. One of the most crucial parts of the lost cause ideology is the idea that the Old South, where white slave owners ruled over everyone else, will rise again. This was often compared to the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and was such a common idea that historians now refer to it as the lost cause religion. It's described as marrying the ideas of Confederate heroism and Christian piety. Basically a prototype for today's white Christian nationalism. Now, while some stayed in the South clinging to dead dreams of national white domination, others went west, claiming the rest of the continent as their own, under orders from God. But as post-Civil War America grew in size and power, so did adherents of these racist philosophies. This is when we get the KKK, legal segregation, and rabid anti-communist movements, all of which were used to oppress people of color, women, and the queer community. But it was really during the civil rights era when the right turned their affinity for Christian branding up to an 11. Many white Americans, especially in the South, were terrified of desegregation. But as it gained popularity across the country, it was becoming at least more frowned upon to be outwardly aggressively racist. So just like slave owners before, and fanatical transphobes now, these people used Christianity as a way to excuse their bigotry, sanitizing their view that America is meant for white Christians. I mean, you can't get mad at someone for listening to God. This obviously didn't work, but that didn't stop racists from clinging to the rotting remains of segregated America. In many places, church congregations were still whites only, and as public schools began to desegregate, many white people sent their children to private religious schools that could accept certain students and reject others. In some places, these white so-called Christian academies were used as a reason to underfund public schools. Because of that, in other places, public schools were closed altogether. Remember that for later. I consider this the first true form of modern white Christian nationalism. As the government gave more freedom to black people, bigots had to use private religious institutions to skirt the law. This created countless exclusively white communities that were primarily characterized by their Christian affiliation. But the reality is at the time, America was becoming more progressive, and conservatives were losing power. Additionally, crazy left ideas like accessible reproductive healthcare, state recognition of gay people, and secularism in schools were becoming norms across the country. And at a certain point, the federal government told private schools they could either keep their segregationist racist policies or their tax-exempt status, but not both. Conservative white evangelicals saw this as an attack on their religious freedom and political control. That's why in 1976, Baptist minister Jerry Falwell founded the Moral Majority. To Falwell and friends, Jimmy Carter's support of the Equal Rights Amendment and communist ideas like social welfare programs were a direct threat to their power. So they organized with other members of the Christian right, especially in the South, to create an organization that could lobby for greater Christian rule in American politics. To the moral majority, this meant attacking women's rights and abortion, criminalizing homosexuality, and removing any limitations on increased military arms. Because Jesus loves nukes. This crescendoed in 1980 when the moral majority and other similar groups provided Ronald Reagan with the first significant united Christian conservative voting bloc. One that married the ideas of taking freedoms from others and a Christian American identity. To this day, what many people know as the evangelical voting bloc is essential to any right-winger who wants to win office. But they don't need to be a pastor or even that religious. These candidates just need to commit to the views that group wants to hear in the technical name of God. It's how a serial philanderer and legally designated rapist who doesn't know it's called 2 Corinthians can not only win the presidency, but have his administration characterized like this.
I would argue that it's probably 3 of the greatest years since maybe Jesus walked the earth with his ministry.
Now, we've talked about a lot, but what is actually driving white Christian nationalists? Well, no group is a monolith, and certain people will have higher priorities. But the most common thread between all of them is that this belief system is motivated by fear. Fear of progress, fear of divergence, fear of a loss of power. Because most of these people see rights as a zero-sum game. There is a finite amount of freedom in the world, and if we give some of it to, say, women, then men will lose their own. Most, if not all, conspiracy theories follow this exact same format. I mean, you don't blame anything on Jewish space lasers unless you're terrified of everything beyond your narrow worldview. But along with a fear of losing power comes resentment. White Christian nationalists feel like this country belongs to them, and it makes them angry that they have to share it and share the power with anyone else. So it's very easy for people to gain political power by manipulating and inflaming that fear and resentment. Now, first, I should emphasize what white Christian nationalists don't believe, what doesn't motivate them. And that's what millions of Christians would call actual Christian values. Like I've said, the religion part of all of this is inextricably tied to the race part. I'd bet a lot of money if Jesus was alive today, a poor refugee who hung around derelicts and condemned rich people, many on the right would attack him for being woke. In fact, some evangelical preachers have attested that when they preach Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, some people in their congregation have complained that they're pushing liberal values. But I do understand how all of this is hard to reconcile. These are two directly opposing ideas. But that's why I want to stress how much far-right ideology relies on cognitive dissonance, the ability to hold two conflicting ideas in your head at the same time. For example, calling yourself a Christian while you rail against welfare programs, defending freedom while you dismantle civil rights, or spamming that one MLK quote while ignoring all the other stuff he said.
You don't judge people by the color of their skin, the content of their character.
I'd go as far to say that hypocrisy is essential to fascism, especially when it comes to recruiting people for your cause that are uncomfortable with the more caustic rhetoric. So that's one of the main ways white Christian nationalists justify their thinking. On the other hand, some just change reality to fit their own belief system. This is how we get such aggressive rhetoric from a supposedly peaceful group, because they re-masculinize Jesus. Basically, to justify violence and authoritarianism in the name of the Prince of Peace, the white Christian right has spent the last century retconning Jesus from a neutered, limp-wristed sky fairy, an actual quote from evangelical pastor Mark Driscoll, to an aggro, hyper-masculine warrior, just like every big, strong white American man. This might sound weird, but think about it. Religion is supposed to be a core part of your belief system. So what happens if you worship some pacifist soy boy who washes his buddy's feet and doesn't even own a gun? You very well may turn gay. Now, this type of testosteronic thinking directly translates to the IRL leadership white Christian nationalists want. They want a warrior, someone who will fight for them and against their perceived persecution. As Gorski and Perry write, they want a fighter for Christians, read people like us, not someone who fights like a Christian. This is how a guy like Trump can get so much support from conservative Christians, while a guy like Pence, well, you know. So now that we know how we got here, let's talk about the real-life priorities of white Christian nationalists, as voters and in our government. And number one on that list is authoritarianism. This is the foundation for white Christian nationalism, and the ultimate goal for the movement. It serves as the arbiter for everything else I'll mention in this video.
This is why you need fascism. Okay.
Authoritarianism is a system of governance that concentrates most power in a central figure, at the expense of democracy, checks and balances, and civil liberties. It's usually characterized by a specific ideology that is forced on its citizens, and requires total obedience and conformity to whatever the party in power demands. Remember, these people want to force their ideology on you, whether you want it or not. And it's not limited to their religious affiliation. All of the ideas they've associated with Christianity and whiteness in America come with the sabotage of our democracy. Basically, it's the world's worst buy one, get 10 free deal. Now, fascism and authoritarianism are inherently rooted in a desire for a strongman, that warrior figure I mentioned before. And whether it's white, roided up Jesus or Vladimir Putin shirtless on horseback, the vision is the same. We need an indomitable leader who will come in and enact a specific vision at any cost. This is how authoritarian leaders get elected in the first place. Adolf Hitler, maybe the most infamous dictator of all time, preyed on Germans' fear in the face of their financial ruin, and fanned the flames of existing racism to promise that he alone could deliver them. Mussolini did the same, specifically hitting on the importance of traditional values to activate a base that was apprehensive of an increasingly modernized world. Now, most Christian nationalists are hesitant to endorse the vision of Hitler or Mussolini, at least publicly, but they frequently praise authoritarian leaders in power right now. In fact, if you want to know what kind of country America's white Christian nationalists have in mind, take a look at Viktor Orban's Hungary. He's built an authoritarian, dissent-crushing, freedom-squelching regime on the basis of nationalist rhetoric, especially focused on anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic, and anti-LGBTQ ideas. America's white Christian nationalists love Orban. They love him so much, they held a special edition of CPAC, the right-wing activist conference, in Hungary. Oh, and Kevin Roberts, the head of the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025, says Orban's Hungary is the model for what they want to do in America. All of these men run brutal regimes and keep their power through aggressive nationalist rhetoric and by using the state to squash dissent. And that's because fear is always the tool of choice for authoritarianism. And right now, white Christian nationalists are motivated by that same type of fear. They're scared of losing a place of societal superiority, of having to accept coexistence with people unlike them rather than dominating with the government's approval. To them, the liberal dream of a diverse, modern society means losing their own dream of a country where they alone hold the power. So their solution is to cheat the system, to get someone in power who will overwrite the will of most Americans to enact God's vision. And this isn't some alarmist rhetoric from a crazy lib. They're telling us this every day.
Anyone who gets things done in Washington has to be a dictator. Only the Nazis wanted a great country, I guess.
We need a good authoritarian leader for like 10 years. It's just a healthy, cathartic reset.
We need to take control of the media or take control of the government and force the people to believe what we believe, or force them to play by our rules and reshape the society.
Unfortunately, this is not just rhetoric happening in the fringes. The white Christian nationalist push for authoritarianism is active and ongoing across the country. I mean, just 3 years ago, a bunch of these people tried to overturn a democratic election in the name of God. Thankfully, the attempted insurrection on January 6th failed. But many state and local governments, where some of the most consequential and enactable laws are passed, aren't as lucky. Ron DeSantis is a textbook example of authoritarianism on the state level. His administration has spent the last 5 years trying to consolidate power wherever they can, appointing sympathetic cronies in key positions of power, and using the state to punish anyone who threatens his power, from private businesses to elected officials. And DeSantis portrays all of this as a mission from God.
And on the 8th day, God looked down on his planned paradise and said, I need a protector. So God made a fighter.
Authoritarian Christian nationalism is flourishing at the local level as well, often flying beneath the national radar. For example, in Colorado, a guy named Andrew Womack has helped people from the church he runs to take over his local school board.
This county ought to be totally dominated by believers.
These people aren't subtle. Now, with every authoritarian movement comes physical violence, and white Christian nationalism is no different. Research shows that people with white Christian nationalist views are a lot more likely to support political violence for their own gain than other Americans. In fact, the Religion News Service reported that white Christian nationalists are about twice as likely to believe political violence may be justified to get the country back on track. So it's no surprise that white Christian nationalists often engage in overtly violent rhetoric. A key part of this identity is self-victimization. White Christian nationalists, especially the men, believe they are the most oppressed people in society, constantly under fire from the liberals in power.
The FBI as an organization has joined in the hunt for Christians.
There is an issue and an affront and a war on Christians in America. The war on white people continues.
A big inspiration for this mindset is the Great Replacement theory, a white supremacist conspiracy theory that has inspired countless mass shooters and is now regularly espoused by Christian nationalists across the country. I could make an entire separate video essay about the Great Replacement theory, but here's the gist. Liberals are trying to replace white, and especially white Christian Americans, with immigrants. Well, black and brown immigrants. Oh, and by the way, this is all being run by the Jews. This theory has been popular in fringe right-wing circles for the last decade, but in 2021, Tucker Carlson made it mainstream.
That the left and all the little gatekeepers on Twitter become literally hysterical if you use the term replacement, if you suggest that the Democratic Party is trying to replace the current electorate, the voters now casting ballots, with new people, more obedient voters from the third world. But they become hysterical because that's what's happening, actually. Let's just say it, that's true.
He was rightfully condemned for this statement, but that didn't matter. The floodgates were open. After all, if the top cable news host in the country can say it...
The Great Replacement? Yeah, it's not a conspiracy theory. It's their electoral strategy. Remember the Great Replacement theory? It sounds more like a statistical fact. They will change the electorate. Again, they say that. We're not guessing.
Why can't our elected officials?
Joe Biden's open border is killing Ohioans, with more illegal drugs and more Democrat voters pouring into this country.
Is it really they want to remake the demographics of America to ensure that they stay in power forever?
This is trying to take over our country without firing a shot.
So when you combine all of that with a religious devotion to certain ideas, white Christian nationalists are able to justify violence at any cost.
It feels like there's a battle between good versus evil, a spiritual battle that is being brewing in America.
I'm a Christian, but I'm done turning the other cheek.
Because we're willing to die in the holy war, we will make them die in the holy war.
Now imagine what happens when those people are in power. It's easy to simply write off these violent statements as political rhetoric, or to think that could never happen in America. But it's already reality. White Christian nationalists have consistently used violence for their own gain throughout our history. The KKK burned crosses and lynched black people in the name of their white Christian utopia. George Tiller, an abortion doctor, was murdered by an anti-abortion extremist who considered himself part of the Army of God, and that was in 2009. And some of the worst mass shootings in our country's history are being committed in the name of white Christian nationalism. Far-right actors want to characterize these as one-offs, individual acts of violence that have nothing to do with each other. But the Stop the Steal rally on January 6th, that was in part organized by far-right evangelical groups. Some of their members were participants in the violence against Capitol Police. Others conducted prayers before and after breaching the Capitol, in many cases invoking biblical violence to justify the riot. Hell, the QAnon shaman not only led prayer inside the Capitol, but has said he breached the doors at God's behest. Since then, violent rhetoric from the far right has ramped up, often calling for state-sanctioned violence once they get into power.
The mainstream media should be charged, the folks that made the calls at the top, with treason to this nation.
Leadership requires killing people, sorry.
Give me liberty or give you death. Signed, sealed, and fucking delivered.
Believe them when they tell you who they are. Now, if you've watched any Fox News in the last 5 years, you've probably heard a lot about our schools. Critical race theory, drag queen story hour, parental rights. These are now common talking points for the right. And that's because authoritarian movements seek to quash education. Nazi Germany had its famous book burnings, the Soviet Union conducted mass exterminations of academics, and the Cultural Revolution in China hunted down teachers and the overeducated bourgeoisie. In all of these cases, schools were shuttered, and curricula that benefited the regime, usually focused on a specific ideology or pseudoscience and eugenics, were installed instead. I say this all the time, but authoritarianism is antithetical to the human condition. You might have noticed, but it never wins in the end. However, if you want to prolong your regime, you'll have much better luck trying to mold young minds than change old ones. Now, the right has accused liberals of Marxist indoctrination and getting rid of free speech in our schools, but it's really the opposite. College campuses, for instance, are seen as a hotbed for leftist brainwashing. The reality is just that kids are finally meeting new people and hearing new ideas. Ideas and people that, say, Ron DeSantis would prefer didn't exist. In our K-12 education system, educators have been attacked as groomers for informing kids that queer people exist. That's just true. And pretending otherwise not only leaves students unprepared for the real world, but also erases queer students and same-sex parents. White Christian nationalists seek to control our educational system because then they control an entire generation's perceived reality. A reality that should be godly and patriotic and usher in a new age of conservative supremacy, rather than adapt to the current interconnected, diverse modern world. And before you ask about separation between church and state, that doesn't matter to these people. They've said as much.
There is no separation of church and state. It's a fabrication. It's a fiction. It's not in the Constitution. It's made up by secular humanists.
Separation of church and state found nowhere in our founding documents.
I think that we have to get over this fantasy of neutrality in institutions and schools.
And all of this, of course, applies to public schools as well.
Public schools are religious schools.
Let me say this again. White Christian nationalists desire a new educational reality, one that revolves around a Christian God and a white America. This is the onus for groups like Moms for Liberty, an extremist organization that advocates for more conservatism, less education, and zero vaccines in our schools. They are a large part of the right-wing push to take over school boards. Oh yeah, all of that drama about school board elections on your local news? Another non-coincidence.
It's more important to go run for your local school board than it is just to show up for another political rally. And trust me, I'm all for political rallies.
We need Christian men and women running, especially for school boards.
Are we going to start taking over these school boards?
Absolutely. We're going to take over the school boards, but that's not enough. Once we replace the school boards, what we need to do is we need to have search firms that are conservative search firms that help us to find new educational leaders.
Whether it's under the guise of teaching children godly values, protecting their innocence, or preserving parental rights, white Christian nationalists are currently degrading education across the country in the name of their ideology. Oklahoma is basically a prototype for what these people would like to accomplish nationally. And that's in large part thanks to this guy, Ryan Walters, the state superintendent of public instruction. I should note that Walters probably wouldn't be in this position if he hadn't been appointed Secretary of Education in 2020 by Governor Stitt. Now, Walters, along with the help of other white Christian nationalists in the Oklahoma government, has made it his mission to take liberal indoctrination and critical race theory out of public schools and replace them with a Christian God. As of this year, Oklahoma public schools are required to incorporate the Bible in lesson plans. This order was spearheaded by Walters, who also just requested $6 million to put Bibles in every classroom. Walters has also surrounded himself with other far-right extremists. For example, he appointed the woman behind Libs of TikTok, an account which has inspired bomb threats and harassment campaigns to schools and hospitals across the country, to Oklahoma's Library Advisory Committee. Some fun facts about this. She doesn't live in Oklahoma, advocates for book bans on a near daily basis, and once posted a doctored video that caused Tulsa schools to be inundated with some of those aforementioned bomb threats. Great stuff. Of course, this type of political maneuvering is not unique to Oklahoma. In Florida, Ron DeSantis has essentially banned the word gay from the classroom, along with hundreds of books and comprehensive sex education. But ideally, these people would like to just get rid of public schools altogether. White Christian nationalists and Project 2025 have repeatedly called to eliminate the Department of Education.
There really shouldn't be public schools, should there?
We need a mass exodus from the public school system.
So until you can get rid of the Federal Department of Education, which every Republican candidate should run on.
Some more enthusiastically than others.
Kill the Department of Education, kill it with fire, burn it down, dance around its ashes. Metaphorically, I mean.
Of course, right now that's not feasible, which is why the right has chosen to prioritize charter schools. These are institutions that receive public educational funding, but are exempt from many of the requirements and qualifications that public schools have. This is what right-wingers are talking about when they say school choice. Despite the many scandals associated with charter schools, particularly a litany of corruption and financial crimes, the right has positioned school choice as one of its top priorities. Until they can totally eliminate the DOE, they want the government to subsidize charter schools, where the regulations are few and the uncertified teachers are many. And a recent Supreme Court decision has opened the door to a future of taxpayer-funded religious charter schools. And that future is now in places like Oklahoma, where the state just approved its first taxpayer-funded religious charter school. And it's true in Arizona, where a voucher program sent so much money to a megachurch's unregulated school that the public schools around it had to shut down. Sound familiar? Make no mistake about it. If white Christian nationalists get more power, this is the future of our educational system. Now it's time to talk about the albatross hanging around the anti-choice movement's neck right now: abortion. It's no secret the far right doesn't like women.
I think that virtually every societal ill that we are facing today is because of women.
From attacking childless cat ladies, to insisting they stay with abusers, to forcing them to carry their rapist baby. And that's just Ohio Senator J.D. Vance. For a while, a lot of conservative women could shrug off this rhetoric, especially if it didn't directly affect them. But since Roe v. Wade was overturned, abortion has been the largest electoral thorn in the far-right side. Let me be very clear. Restricting abortion is unpopular. By a large margin. Women across parties disapprove of abortion bans. It is one of, if not the biggest issue for women voters. And every electoral attempt to further restrict abortion has failed, even in red states. But while plenty of right-wingers have railed against abortion in the past, the reason we're here, where women are bleeding out in ER bathrooms because doctors are too scared to treat them, is because of white Christian nationalism. Until the late 70s, evangelicals largely considered abortion a Catholic issue. Jerry Falwell, the founder of that group Moral Majority, which we talked about before, didn't even preach his first anti-abortion sermon until 5 years after Roe v. Wade. So what changed? How did we get from there to describing abortion like this?
You are promoting an ancient religious rite called human sacrifice.
Remember when we talked about segregation and the Christian right? And when the government threatened to take tax-exempt status from Christian institutions if they kept being racist? Well, leaders in these extreme conservative movements didn't like that. But they realized pure racism was no longer enough motivation to recruit less openly prejudiced voters to their cause. So their solution was abortion. This framing worked on 3 levels. Number 1, saving babies is a hell of a rallying cry. Number 2, the structure was inherently anti-government. And number 3, controlling women's bodies played into extreme evangelical ideas about women and social roles. Because abortion is not just about abortion. It's about controlling women's bodies and women's lives by taking away their privacy, forcing them into motherhood, and keeping them at home. Now, banning abortion is a 2-pronged approach. First off, you have to legally restrict healthcare. But second, you're also trying to usher in a new age where your political beliefs are seen as a status quo. As one Project 2025 ally so eloquently said,
we should make abortion unthinkable, but I'm over here going, well, it should also be unavailable too. Like, it has to be both things.
It's easy to underestimate the goals for this movement, but don't. Before I get into some of the ludicrous anti-choice goals white Christian nationalists have said on the record, let's talk about current legislation that exists right now. Texas restricts abortion to 6 weeks after conception, before the vast majority of people even realize they're pregnant. But on top of that, the state has passed what is essentially an abortion bounty hunting law. If you know someone who got an abortion, even across state lines, you can sue anyone who helped them for $10,000. And even if you're not successful, the defendant can't recoup their legal costs. This is a recipe for vigilante harassment against medical providers, women, and their loved ones. Idaho also restricts abortion after 6 weeks. This left one woman bleeding out in an ER bathroom because doctors were too scared to treat her. Why? Because if they did, they could lose their medical license and be fined $20,000. Judges have denied children abortion access because they're not mature enough to make the decision. 13-year-olds are being forced to give birth to their rapists' babies. And women are dying preventable deaths because doctors are scared of prison time if they do their jobs. All in the name of God and the sanctity of life. Speaking of life, these are the same people trying to ban IVF and describe gay couples using a surrogate like this.
It is a form of trafficking.
Every single adult involved in this should be imprisoned for life, at least.
If you found any of that scary, you should hear what else white Christian nationalists have planned. State surveillance of your menstrual cycle, federal laws to keep you from crossing state lines if you have a vagina, and the death penalty for reproductive care, just to name a few. In case it wasn't obvious, white Christian nationalists seek to take away your freedoms. And this is already happening, right now, in the United States, to millions of American women. And it could be expanded further into even more states with more extreme measures if white Christian nationalists get any more access to power. But as the right has hemorrhaged voters thanks to the Christian nationalist crusade against abortion, it's hoping to gain some of them back with another extreme authoritarian tactic: aggressively attacking the LGBTQ community. Queer people are often forced to be canaries in a proto-fascist coal mine, as authoritarians tend to target them first. And America is no different. We have a history of this. The Lavender Scare was one of the first state-sanctioned discrimination campaigns against queer people in the US. It worked in tandem with Joseph McCarthy's Red Scare, painting gay men and lesbians as national security risks. And as the gay liberation movement picked up in the 60s and 70s, especially after the Stonewall riots, those conservative Christian groups I mentioned before grew with it. Singer Anita Bryant launched a campaign to save our children, i.e. reinstate laws that discriminated against queer people. The AIDS crisis also ushered in a new age of homophobia. This was exacerbated by Ronald Reagan, whose inaction, partly because he didn't want to alienate his new white evangelical conservative voting bloc, led to at least 100,000 deaths from the disease. And throughout the years, mass shootings and hate crimes have occurred across the country in the name of homophobic and transphobic bigotry. Things started to improve in the 2010s, as decades of political organizing and cultural change worked their way into the law. Gay marriage was legalized, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed, and it became more possible for LGBTQ Americans to live openly and honestly while serving in the government, military, and just about everywhere else. But the backlash has never died. Lots of the same people who worked for years to overturn Roe v. Wade now want the conservative Supreme Court to overturn its marriage equality ruling. In other words, they don't just want to take gay books out of the libraries, they want to go back to a time when gay people couldn't get married, or when states could criminalize homosexuality. They know most Americans won't agree with that agenda. That's why they focused on building their power by demonizing transgender people. It's an explicit political strategy, even if they do sound ridiculous sometimes.
The guy in a dress is 1,000,000 times more objectionable than blackface. Really more than 1,000,000 times. It's infinite.
If you have red blood in your veins, then you do not buy a Bud Light product.
So do not shop at Target, or else you're gay and you're a pervert.
Queer people, and particularly trans people, are being villainized on a daily basis by far-right politicians, media figures, and religious leaders. Doctors and teachers are accused of grooming children into changing their gender or being sexually active. States are trying to shut down private queer spaces like drag shows. And hate crimes against LGBTQ individuals have skyrocketed in the last few years. This, unfortunately, isn't surprising. Not when so many far-right figures talk about queer people like this.
Transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely.
Well, it's a social contagion right now that this is happening.
Transgender is potentially more of a threat if applied recklessly than, say, white supremacy, okay?
LGBTQ people are being labeled as pedophiles, aberrations, affronts to God himself and his plans for the traditional family. Because that's what all of this is supposedly about, the traditional family. Translation: the specific type of family white Christian nationalists approve of.
Dr. Levine is part of a cultural Marxist movement that wants to erase gender in order to destroy notions of the traditional family. They want to destroy it.
Like everything else I've talked about, this anti-gay hysteria rising alongside authoritarianism is not a coincidence. They go hand in hand. And right now we're in the phase of normalizing this type of hate and bigotry. By framing an issue around protecting children and loving your family, things every person cares about, you can make the oppression of a certain group sound like a societal good. And for the more diehard allies, well, you can always just call trans people demonic. But what this comes down to is an authoritarian regime using LGBTQ people as an other, some scary unknown that is meant to distract their already angry base from the real issues. And the reason we know this is because this is not the first time queer people have been targeted at the start of a rising fascist movement. Current authoritarian regimes target queer people specifically to consolidate their own power. Under Vladimir Putin, for instance, hostility against homosexuality in Russia has increased from 60% to 74% in the last 20 years. Notably, hate crimes against queer people tripled in Russia after the implementation of its gay propaganda law. This started as a ban against distributing homosexual propaganda among minors, to protect their innocence from the scary, scary gay people. But in 2022, Putin signed an amendment that banned any propaganda of non-traditional relationships across the board, no matter your age. Russia's oppressive laws were passed in the name of traditional family values and protecting children, which not only gives white Christian nationalists a reason to ally with the country.
Russia is an Orthodox Christian country with traditional social values, and for that reason, it must be destroyed.
But also eerily mirrors the language of some of our own elected officials.
Why do you think that there is a war against parents right now in America?
Oh, there's a war against a family.
They indoctrinate children and try to turn boys into girls.
And we are going to do battle with anybody that's seeking to rob our children of their innocence.
Think about that for a second. But just a second. Because in some places here, it's already happening. Most Americans are at least aware of Ron DeSantis' war on woke, especially his so-called Don't Say Gay bill. This bill was signed into Florida law in 2022 and prohibits classroom discussion or instruction of sexuality or gender in public schools. Originally, it started as kindergarten through 3rd grade, but DeSantis recently expanded it to include all K through 12 grade levels. I feel like we just talked about this. No, wrong country. This law has loosened slightly after multiple lawsuits, but it's just one of many extreme anti-LGBTQ laws that have passed under DeSantis. This includes banning gender-affirming care for minors, allowing insurers and providers to discriminate in patient care and hiring, and opening the door to remove race or gender studies from higher ed. Other states have followed suit, erasing queer existence from their educational system, banning gender-affirming care, and ensuring anti-LGBTQ discrimination at both the state and local level. Oh, and on the federal level, if white Christian nationalists get their way, workplace protections, healthcare access, and military service are on the immediate chopping block. And so to manufacture consent for these extremist policies, right-wing pundits have been attacking the queer community on repeat, often calling for or directly inspiring violence. Anti-LGBTQ posts from Lives with TikTok, which are often amplified by elected officials, have been linked to dozens of bomb threats and harassment campaigns against schools, libraries, and children's hospitals. Other Christian nationalist figures have called for queer people, doctors, and teachers to be jailed.
Republicans need to wield the law to arrest these people. This is sick stuff.
People should be arrested for supporting Drag Time Story Hour.
These doctors need to be put in prison quickly.
Or even executed.
A Nuremberg-style trial for every gender-affirming clinic doctor. We need it immediately.
And if you come for their kids, they're probably going to exercise their Second Amendment rights.
I might kill that person. That's where we're at.
White Christian nationalists seek to take rights away from everybody they disapprove of. And right now, the homos top that list. But someone has to come next. I cannot stress this enough. We have seen this happen before, and it never stops here. So think about what they want, and if you could live under that. Because to white Christian nationalists, it is imperative that you conform to their narrow standards. This means following their interpretation of the Bible, espousing their political views, and acting, dressing, and living in a way that they approve of. Anything else deserves full and robust consequences. So tell me, can you do it? Now, everything we've talked about is being done and said in the name of Jesus Christ, even if it's a version of Jesus that millions of Christians wouldn't recognize. Nevertheless, these tenets are central to the white Christian nationalist agenda. Authoritarianism is necessary to impose that white Christian value system. Violence is necessary because those same white Christians are also somehow an oppressed class. We have to disassemble our education system to convert an entire generation to a specific ideology. We need to ban abortion to ensure that women stay in their God-assigned roles. And we have to get rid of those evil LGBTQ groomers, because otherwise they're gonna nuke the nuclear family. So it shouldn't be surprising that the last major tenet of white Christian nationalism that we're gonna discuss is religious discrimination. The most obvious way they do this, of course, is through villainization. Villainization of Islam.
You have to admit there is a Muslim problem in the world.
There is a reverse crusade in progress, a Christian genocide.
Islam would gut Christian and Jew alike if it could and has.
Of Judaism.
Jews have been some of the largest funders of cultural Marxist ideas and supporters of those ideas over the last 30 or 40 years.
Talmudic Judaism is closer to witchcraft, in my opinion.
I consider these Jews to be domestic enemies.
Right.
Hinduism.
I don't think that the forms or the expressions of God's judgment merely lie with Drag Queen Story Hour, but that they also include the fact that my neighborhood is 30% Hindu.
Buddhism.
He's said to be a Buddhist. I don't think that faith offers the kind of forgiveness and redemption that is offered by the Christian faith.
Sikhism.
She's been exposed as a fake Christian who pimps Christianity for votes while taking part in third world Sikh rituals because she's an Indian.
And of course, people with no religion at all.
Do the atheists in Wisconsin realize they're going to hell?
Your atheism isn't going to stick. Your wokeism isn't going to stick.
This is a Christian nation. Like, why do we have a bunch of atheists and pagans in power and Satanists?
Notice how all of those faiths were framed as inherently threatening to Christianity, especially Judaism. That's because despite spamming the phrase Judeo-Christian values in public, much of the white Christian nationalist vision is built on anti-Semitism, especially anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. These types of lies have existed for centuries, and historically have been used to justify racist massacres, state-sanctioned oppression, and the literal genocide of Jews. In their current and most popular iteration, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories follow much of their predecessors' outlines, just with new characters. So instead of running the banks and inspiring communists, Jews like George Soros control the TikTok algorithm, while also still running the banks and inspiring communists. Hey, if the racist conspiracy theory ain't broke, why fix it? Oh, and by the way, white Christian nationalists have similarly vicious things to say about Christians who don't accept their worldview. You know, the idea that they should control everything and have dominion over everybody. Liberal cucks. Now, the final goal for all of this, for everything we talked about, is simple. Force the entire country to follow a white Christian nationalist interpretation of the Christian faith. But they wouldn't just cultivate white Christian nationalist beliefs. Some of them want to explicitly enforce a white Christian nationalist theocracy, where the rules are made by people like Charlie Kirk.
And the Civil Rights Act, though, let's be clear, created a beast, and that beast has now turned into an anti-white weapon.
There is a religious motive here, but as we've discussed throughout this video, it's equally political. It's about power. A white Christian nationalist theocracy would mean all of those cultural and legislative goals that we've discussed would be imposed at the same level as religion. This is their endgame, and we know that because they tell us.
The idea that religion and politics do not mix is a lie the devil came up with to keep Christians from running their own country.
I want to make sure that everyone believes in what I believe in. It's that everyone needs to believe in Christianity.
What I want is a political revolution that puts Christians in the position to change the laws, and the laws will govern the conduct of public and private affairs. Like, it's that simple.
Far-right voices have spent decades trying to implement religious requirements for our leaders and ban non-Christians from office. And they continue to do so now. Not only that, but they're getting more brazen about it. A powerful group of white Christian nationalists have now demanded that the next president only consider Supreme Court nominees that meet their biblical worldview. This is scary. And it's not hypothetical, because for all of its public flops and online cringe, the right is really good at one thing. It's long game. And that has most clearly manifested in a little thing called Project 2025. Written by the Heritage Foundation, an extremely conservative think tank, the Mandate for Leadership, also known as Project 2025 and the Presidential Transition Project, is a 900-page guidebook for how white Christian nationalists can easily implement their goals under a conservative president. And that agenda is batshit. It paints a picture of a country run under a strict white Christian nationalist regime. It would jettison government services, target anyone who's not a straight white Christian man, and sell any resulting power vacuums to the highest bidder. But before we get into the specific policies of Project 2025, let's talk about who's behind it. Now, since Project 2025 became public knowledge, many high-ranking political figures have tried to publicly distance themselves from it, and I don't blame them. Most Americans would rather let RFK Jr. pet sit than live under this nightmare for a single day. But if you look at the numbers, it's hard to find distance between Project 2025 and the last conservative administration. Of its almost 280 contributors, at least 140 of them worked in that administration. Nearly 2/3 of its authors and editors worked in it as well, and 25 of its 30 chapters were written by administration officials. Not only that, but this isn't even the Heritage Foundation's first mandate for leadership. They've written one of these every election cycle since 1981. And that last conservative administration implemented 64% of the 2016 mandate for leadership policy recommendations within its first year. I mean, the Heritage Foundation's own website brags that that administration's policies and Supreme Court nominees were based on heritage advice. But no matter who this hypothetical sympathetic conservative president could be, the content of Project 2025 can't be ignored. The goals are clear. Take away freedoms, opportunities, and a safety net from anyone the Heritage Foundation deems unworthy. It's a wish list for the country's most extreme white Christian nationalists, and a blueprint for how to make those fucked up dreams come true. First up, consolidating power in their strongman. Project 2025 calls for taking partisan control of the DOJ, FBI, FCC, FTC, and Department of Commerce, and eliminating their independence so they would be directly under presidential control. Additionally, tens of thousands of civil servants would be reclassified as at-will employees, and most likely fired. But don't worry, they'll be easy to replace with Project 2025's personnel database, a digital library of pre-vetted ideological warriors. Under a Project 2025 government, state prosecutors could also face legal action from the federal government if they don't prosecute offenses that the administration deems criminal. Right now, many on the right accuse Democratic states of not prosecuting enough people of color, especially for crimes like protesting. So in a Project 2025 world, the federal government can abuse their power to make sure that happens. Oh, and on top of that, the DOJ would use the full force of federal prosecutorial resources to prosecute any institution, public or private, for participating in diversity initiatives. I'm glad they have their priorities straight. When it comes to education, Project 2025 proposes eliminating the DOE, elevating school choice, i.e. charter or religious schools, and cutting services for low-income students, like free school meals, the Head Start program, and federal funds meant for impoverished families. Teachers' unions would also be eliminated, and anything the right deems critical race theory would be banned from classrooms. Project 2025 also praises the Dobbs decision, calling it just the beginning. It aims to ban abortion pills, erase the phrase reproductive health from anywhere in the government, and force states to report every unsuccessful pregnancy to the HHS. The Comstock Act of 1873 would get a reboot, and any sender or recipient of anything that could be used for an abortion could be criminally prosecuted. To confront radical gender ideology, Project 2025 proposes rescinding any regulations preventing discrimination against sexual orientation, gender identity, transgender status, or sex characteristics. This could also include cisgender women, by the way. Additionally, anything that relates to gender or sexual identity would be removed from every federal rule, agency regulation, contract, grant, and piece of legislation that exists. Trans kids would have pretty much no access to gender-affirming care, and while the Heritage Foundation was at least smart enough to not exclusively commit to Christianity in writing, Project 2025 does call religious devotion and spirituality the greatest sources of happiness around the world. More than that, Heritage Foundation President Kevin Roberts gives a remarkably limited definition of freedom in his introduction to Project 2025. Here's what he wrote. When the founders spoke of pursuit of happiness, what they meant might be understood today as, in essence, pursuit of blessedness. That is, an individual must be free to live as his creator ordained, to flourish. Our Constitution grants each of us the liberty to do not what we want, but what we ought. In other words, in a Project 2025 country, you only have the freedom to live according to the Heritage Foundation's interpretation of the Bible. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Like I said, it's a 900-page document. There's a lot of insane shit in here. Banning pornography, getting rid of free weather reports, a federal God-ordained Sabbath rest. Look, I'm all for days off, but not because God gave them to us. Unions did. Immigration would be attacked from every angle. Healthcare would be gutted, and any progress made in the fight against climate change would be rolled back and worsened tenfold. If a president adopted just 64% of these policies again, things would get very bad very fast. These people learned their lesson after 2020, and they want one more shot to make their fascist hellscape a reality. They're planning to make it count by dismantling every part of our democracy as fast as possible. This is the only way they can get their white Christian nationalist vision.
Reshape the society.
I know this all sounds pretty scary. I don't like thinking about it. But ignoring the reality, the rhetoric from the far right, the goals of Project 2025, and the promises made by some of the most extreme people in our government only helps them. This all falls apart under scrutiny. Yeah, it turns out people generally don't like authoritarian theocracies. And that's why far-right figures are trying to publicly distance themselves from Project 2025. But I do have good news. The vast majority of Americans don't want to live in a Project 2025 reality. And we still have time to make sure we don't have to. Like I said, this stuff falls apart under scrutiny. That's why maybe the most important thing you can do in the fight against authoritarianism is talk about it. Call it out and make sure other people know what's happening. Talk to the people in your life. Tell them what you've learned. Hell, send this video to them. Because we should all be on alert for white Christian nationalist rhetoric, especially when it comes from people who are trying to gain power in our communities. If we know it, then we can identify it. And if we can identify it, then we can resist it. In a similar vein, it is also vitally important to sound the alarm. Publicly speaking out against white Christian nationalism, Project 2025, and far-right goals sends a message that this kind of authoritarianism and this kind of bigotry will not be tolerated. Whether it's in conversations with your friends, social media posts, or just generally in public, discussion and denouncement of this agenda spreads the word and makes a stand. Finally, mobilize resistance when you see white Christian nationalism arising in your community. Like I've said, the state and local levels are especially vulnerable to this kind of far-right maneuvering, and they want you to ignore them. So being active in your community, watching your area officials, and using your voice publicly can make a world of difference. Not just for you, but for all of the people around you. Write letters to the editor, figure out who your local reporters are, and bring attention to any white Christian nationalist attempt to hijack your town or state government. You can also donate to my friends at the People for the American Way Foundation, which partnered with me to make this video. They work toward a vision of a vibrant America, where basic freedoms and rights are upheld for all. And they're often the first people to call out underreported white Christian nationalist plans.
A political revolution that puts Christians in the position to change the laws.
Remember, everything we've talked about, those are not hypotheticals. White Christian nationalists have already enacted parts of this plan at the state and local levels. We need to not only fight against it now, but make sure that doesn't spread any further. And it's truly up to all of us to make sure that doesn't happen.